It was a quiet morning, the kind of morning you don't think twice about, until it suddenly feels off. The sun was breaking through the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee steaming in front of me, but I wasn't really drinking it. I hadn't been drinking much of anything lately. My attention was on her, my wife sitting just outside under the oak tree in the yard, sipping her coffee like she did every day. I'd been watching her for a while now, in a way I hadn't before. For the past few weeks, something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't that she'd changed overnight. No, it was the subtle things, the little moments that didn't quite add up. At first, I dismissed them, but after a while, the small things began stacking up, and I couldn't ignore them any longer. Her phone, always with her, always pressed against her ear or tucked into her hand, as if it was some kind of lifeline. She was always talking to someone, always somewhere else, even when she was right in front of me. And the perfume. It wasn't mine. It wasn't hers either. I've never been one to care much about scent, but this one was unmistakable. It was sharp, too masculine for her, and it lingered in the air long after she'd left the room. I'd been sitting in the living room for about an hour, peering through the blinds, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything that might explain what I was feeling. But all I saw was her, sitting there, reading a book or pretending to. She wasn't doing anything overtly suspicious, but she was too calm, too relaxed, too unaware of my gaze. And that's when it hit me. Maybe she knew I was watching. I had never been the kind of person to spy or snoop. I trust my wife, or at least I used to. But something about the last few days, her nervous glances, the way she kept glancing at the clock, the way she hesitated when I asked about her day, made me wonder if she was hiding something from me. Something big. I wasn't even sure when I first started noticing it. But one thing was certain now. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. Not when it felt like everything was pointing toward one truth I wasn't ready to face. It had started small, but it was growing. The phone calls, the perfume, the little changes in her behavior. A slip here, a quiet whisper there. I decided to watch her again today, but the longer I sat there, the more paranoid I became. What if she knew? What if she was already onto me? And then something happened. It was subtle, almost too quiet to be real. But I heard it. As I watched from my perch by the window, she sat up, her back slightly straightening. She glanced toward the door as if expecting me. But then she said something under her breath, almost to herself. "Vibe, my husband is here." I froze. I couldn't have heard that right. Could I? My heart beat faster, a tight knot forming in my stomach. I didn't want to believe it, but I heard it, clear as day. I stayed there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity, trying to gather myself. She didn't know I'd heard her. I don't think she knew. I stood up slowly, pushing the chair back, my hands feeling cold against the wood. I knew what I had to do next. I couldn't just sit there anymore, pretending I hadn't heard. I wasn't sure what I expected, an explanation, an apology, or maybe just a simple acknowledgement. But I needed to confront this, whatever this was. I walked out to the yard, my mind racing. As I approached her, she didn't look up at first. She was too busy fiddling with her phone again, tapping at the screen as if she hadn't heard anything strange. But I knew better. I had heard her. When I reached the table, she finally looked up, her eyes wide, almost startled, as if she hadn't been expecting me so soon. Her smile was tight, too rehearsed. She quickly shoved her phone in her purse, something I hadn't seen her do in ages. "Hey," she said, her voice normal, too normal. I nodded, taking a seat across from her. "You're busy today?" "Just watching a movie," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. Her smile wavered for a second, like she was trying too hard to convince me. I could feel my pulse quicken. I wanted to ask her about what I had heard, but I held back. I had to stay calm. I couldn't let her see that I was onto her. She was trying to cover something up. That much was clear, but I still didn't know exactly what. I looked at her, studying her face. I wanted to believe that there was nothing more to this, that it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And the worst part? I was afraid to ask, because if I did, I might not like the answer. She picked up her cup, took a sip, and then reached for the remote. "Want to watch something with me?" The tension hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel it, but I didn't say anything. Not yet. Something told me this was just the beginning. Something told me that if I pushed too hard now, I might lose more than I was ready to. I stayed quiet, watching her, and waiting for her to slip up. I just needed one crack, one tiny mistake, to see what was really going on, and when it came, I would be ready. The silence between us lingered for a few moments after she turned the TV on, her fingers dancing over the remote with a practiced ease. I couldn't shake the image of her face, the way it had momentarily faltered when I walked up to her. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, an edge of tension, the tiniest shift in her usual calm. She was hiding something, and I could feel it in my bones, but I couldn't ask. Not yet. Not with that forced smile still hanging on her lips, the one that I knew wasn't real. She was trying so hard to act normal, to keep up appearances. But there was something else beneath the surface. I could almost smell it in the air, fear, guilt, maybe even something darker. I leaned back in my chair, trying to look casual, as if nothing was wrong. I glanced around the yard, my eyes searching for any little clue, any sign that could explain the growing unease inside me. But there was nothing. The grass was still green. The trees still swayed in the breeze. It all looked perfect. Too perfect. Her voice broke through the quiet, light and conversational. "How was work?" she asked, turning to me, her eyes flicking briefly to mine before returning to the screen. "Fine," I replied, trying to sound detached. Same old, same old?" She nodded, but didn't say anything more. Instead, she focused intently on the movie, her usual escape, the thing that always kept her distracted when she didn't want to engage. I couldn't help but wonder if she was avoiding me, avoiding the one question that had been haunting me all morning. I could feel her eyes on me, just for a moment, as if she was gauging my reaction, waiting to see if I'd ask. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I let the conversation drift, pushing down the urge to confront her. This wasn't something I could fix with a simple question. No, I needed more proof, certainty. I needed to know I wasn't just being paranoid. The phone buzzed on the table, cutting through the stillness. She glanced at it quickly, a brief flicker of panic crossing her face before she scooped it up. "I'll be right back," she said, standing abruptly. Her voice was light, but there was an edge to it now. A quickness. She'd never been this quick to leave the room before. Not unless something important was happening. I nodded, though my eyes didn't leave her face. I watched her walk to the other room, and then nothing. The house went silent again. The TV played in the background, but I couldn't focus on it. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments from before. Her words, her strange behavior, the look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't paying attention. My thoughts were racing now, swirling in a mess of doubt and confusion. I knew I had to find out what was going on, but I didn't know where to start. I glanced at the kitchen window. Outside, the day was still beautiful. The light was soft, golden, and everything seemed to be in place. But in my gut, I could feel the unease growing stronger. I had to know what she was doing in the other room. I had to see if this was just a fluke, a trick of my mind, or if there was something truly wrong. I got up slowly, walking toward the hallway, trying not to make a sound. My bare feet made no noise on the wooden floors. As I approached the door to the bedroom, I heard her voice, a soft murmur, low and soothing. She was speaking to someone, but not in the way she usually did. There was something different in the tone, something more intimate. I didn't stop. I kept moving as quietly as I could until I reached the doorway. I hesitated for a moment, just standing there listening. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear enough to know this wasn't a normal conversation. "Yeah, I'll see you soon," she said, and her voice was softer, lower than it had been with me. I froze. My mind snapped into focus. See you soon? What did that mean? Why did she sound so familiar with whoever was on the other end? And then I heard it, the sound that made my heart drop. A quiet laugh, followed by a quick, hushed response. It was a man's voice. Not hers. A man's. I couldn't help myself. I stepped forward, just enough so I could peer into the room, just enough to catch a glimpse of her as she stood by the window, holding the phone to her ear. Her face was turned slightly toward me, but she didn't see me. She was too lost in the conversation, too caught up in whatever world she was sharing with this other person. I watched her for a moment longer, my mind racing as I tried to piece together the fragments of information. She was hiding something. He was part of it. There was no doubt in my mind now. And then, without warning, she turned and looked straight at me. Her face went blank. The color drained from her cheeks for a split second, and I could see the shift in her expression. The shock, the panic, the guilt that quickly replaced it. "Hi," she said, her voice stiff, forced. I didn't respond immediately. I just stood there, frozen in place, staring at her. The phone was still pressed to her ear, but she didn't even seem to care about it anymore. She cleared her throat, lowering the phone. I wasn't expecting you back so soon. I thought you were busy." "I didn't mean to interrupt," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But there was no mistaking the cold edge that slipped into my tone. Her lips pressed together into a thin line, but she didn't say anything more. The air between us felt thick with unspoken words, with secrets, with things I wasn't ready to confront yet. I could see it now. The cracks. They were all there, and they were getting harder to ignore. I just needed to keep pushing, keep watching until I knew everything. And once I did, once I had the truth in my hands, I could decide what to do with it. But right now, all I had was that faint whisper of a laugh, that one small crack in the illusion of our perfect life. And it was enough to make me feel like I was already losing her, losing everything. I turned slowly, taking a few steps back, my mind still processing everything. She stayed silent behind me, the phone still dangling from her hand. But I knew, deep down, that the moment had passed. The moment when we could pretend nothing was wrong. I just wasn't sure how much longer I could keep. I walked back down the hallway, trying to maintain a semblance of control, even though my thoughts were spiraling out of control. The chill in the air, the silence between us, everything felt different now. As I reached the living room, I could still hear her moving in the bedroom behind me, the low hum of her voice as she finished her call. I sat down slowly, still processing what I had just heard. The man's laugh, the intimacy, the casual "see you soon." It was all too much to ignore. I could already feel the weight of what I had uncovered pressing down on me. But I couldn't make sense of it. How long had this been going on? Who was he? And why didn't I see it until now? I leaned forward, rubbing my temples. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe I was reading too much into a brief conversation. But something deep inside told me it wasn't a mistake. The doubt had already settled in, and it was eating at me from the inside. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to see her standing there, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak at first, and neither did I. There was something almost comforting about the silence, something familiar, even though the air between us felt colder than ever. She finally broke the tension. "I think we need to talk." The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment I felt dizzy. My stomach turned. I had no idea what to expect, but deep down, I was already preparing myself for the worst. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "About your phone call?" Her eyes flickered to the floor, and for a moment, she seemed to shrink. The usual confident, carefree woman I knew seemed to vanish in front of me, replaced by someone who was unsure, almost frightened. She bit her lip, as if trying to find the right words. "Look," she said finally. Before she could finish, I stood up abruptly. I needed some space, something to clear my head. I turned toward the door. "I need to take a walk," I muttered, more to myself than to her. But before I could leave, she grabbed my arm gently. Her touch was soft, but the tension in her grip was unmistakable. "Wait, please. I can explain," she said, her voice trembling. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back into her eyes. There was something in them now. It wasn't guilt or fear. It was desperation, a kind of raw, human fear that I hadn't seen in her before. I wasn't sure if it was because of me or because of what she was hiding. "Explain?" I echoed. "What's there to explain, really? I heard you. I know there's someone else." The words came out before I could stop them, the accusation sharp and cutting through the air between us. I could see her flinch at the sharpness of my tone, but I didn't care. It was out now. It was what I was feeling. Her eyes widened, and for a second, I thought she was going to break down. But instead, she looked away, biting her lip again, as if weighing her options. And then something unexpected happened. She started to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of guilt or shame like I expected. It was almost relieved. I stood frozen, unsure of what was going on. This wasn't the reaction I had prepared for. "What?" I asked, my voice low and shaky, my mind struggling to comprehend the sudden shift. "What the hell is so funny?" She wiped a tear from her eye, still holding back the laughter. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice cracking. "You don't understand why I've been acting this way." My heart pounded, and I took a step back. The last thing I expected was for her to laugh at a time like this. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice sharp with disbelief. "You've been lying to me, sneaking around, and now you're what?" "Laughing." She took a deep breath, gathering herself. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling with something I couldn't place. "I've been trying to protect you." "Protect me?" I spat, the irony hitting me like a punch to the gut. "From what?" "From the truth." She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said quietly. "From this." And with that, she reached in her pocket and pulled out her phone. My heart skipped a beat. My eyes locked onto the screen as she unlocked it and handed it to me. "Read it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the phone in my hands, feeling a surge of confusion and dread. My fingers hovered over the screen, but I hesitated. What was she doing? Why was she showing me this? Was this some kind of trick, a way to make me doubt myself, to gaslight me? But she was serious. Her face was pleading, the fear still lingering in her eyes. And so, against my better judgment, I tapped the screen. It was a text message conversation, and it wasn't what I expected. The messages weren't between her and some lover or secret man. They were between me and her. I stared at the screen, my eyes flicking between the messages. They were all from months ago, texts I had sent her when I was working late, asking how her day was, checking in on her. But the strange part? Her responses, the ones I had thought were so normal at the time, had been different. There was a hidden pattern, a series of texts where she had been subtly asking me about my day, about my schedule. The questions seemed innocent at first, but the more I scrolled, the more I realized what she had been doing. The truth hit me like a tidal wave. She wasn't cheating on me. She was trying to protect me from the truth of her own struggle. The phone calls, the secretiveness, it wasn't another man. It was something else entirely. I looked up at her, my mind racing. "What is this?" I whispered. "What's really going on?" She swallowed hard, her eyes meeting mine. And in that moment, I saw something real, something I hadn't recognized until now. "I've been hiding it from you," she said, her voice barely audible, "because I didn't want to hurt you. It's not a lover. It's something far worse. Something that we have been avoiding for a long time." She paused, her breath shaky. "I'm not the one who's been unfaithful. You have." The words hung in the air between us, suspended like a sharp blade, waiting to fall. "You have." Her words hit me harder than anything I could have expected. I stood there, frozen, staring at her. My brain couldn't quite process what she was saying. My mouth felt dry, my heart racing, but I couldn't find the words to respond. I shook my head, trying to force the fog from my thoughts. "Well, what are you talking about?" I stammered, my voice a little too high, a little too unsteady. She looked at me, her eyes searching my face like she was looking for something, an understanding, a reaction, a way out. But she didn't seem afraid anymore. No, there was something else now, a sense of clarity, as if she was seeing me for the first time, and the weight of everything had finally settled on her shoulders. "You've been so focused on me," she said softly, taking a step toward me. "On the little things that don't add up. The phone calls, the perfume, the weird moments. But you haven't looked at yourself. You haven't seen what you've been doing." I took a step back, my mind spinning. "What do you mean?" I haven't done anything." She sighed, almost sadly, and then she reached out and took my hand. "Yes, you have. You just don't know it yet." I was confused, more confused than I'd ever been. My thoughts tangled with every possibility. Had I really been the one who was unfaithful? I racked my brain, trying to find something that made sense, some explanation for this bizarre turn of events. She squeezed my hand, and her gaze softened. You've been so distant lately, so lost in your work, in your own world. You've been emotionally absent, if I'm being honest. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words caught in my throat. I had been distant, hadn't I? Over the past year or so, I'd felt myself drifting away from her, not in a physical sense, but emotionally. Work had consumed me. My thoughts, my time, my attention, everything had been dedicated to my career, to the goals I set for myself. But that didn't mean I'd cheated. Did it? Did it? She didn't give me time to speak, to gather my thoughts. You started putting your work above everything else. You came home late. You were distracted when you were here. And then, she took a breath. You stopped really seeing me. You stopped noticing me the way you used to. And that's when I started feeling like I was losing you. I opened my mouth again, but still, no words came out. She was right, though. I hadn't seen it until now. The distance had grown between us so slowly that I hadn't noticed how far apart we drifted, how little we were truly connecting anymore. And it hurt to hear her say it, because I knew deep down that I had been neglecting her. But how did that make me the one who was unfaithful? There's more to it, though, she said, as if reading my mind. You've been turning to someone else, not physically, but emotionally, and it's been building for months. Her words were a slow burn, each one hitting me harder than the last. My chest tightened. What do you mean? I don't. Her. She said it softly, but firmly. The woman you've been talking to. I felt a sudden jolt, like the floor had just dropped out beneath me. What woman? Her expression shifted, her eyes narrowing just slightly. Don't pretend you don't know, please. The one at work. The one you're always texting. The one whose messages you've been sending and receiving late at night. You've been pouring yourself into her, talking to her about your dreams, your frustrations, your everything. But you haven't been talking to me. Not really. And I think you know exactly who I'm talking about. My heart skipped a beat. I felt the blood drain from my face as the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I thought she was talking about some random woman, some stranger in my life that I had never paid attention to. But she wasn't. She was talking about Sarah. Sarah, my assistant. The woman I'd hired months ago to help with some projects at the office. She was bright, confident, and ambitious. We'd clicked right away, both of us diving into work with an intensity that I hadn't felt in a long time. She was smart, charismatic, and yes, I found myself looking forward to the hours we spent together. We had shared a few personal conversations, laughed about trivial things, and vented about our frustrations at the office. But nothing had ever crossed a line. At least, I thought it hadn't. But now, as I thought about it, I realized how much I'd been leaning on her, confiding in her about things I didn't want to share with my wife. I had been giving her pieces of myself that I had stopped giving to Emily. The weight of the truth came crashing down on me. I didn't mean. I know you didn't, she interrupted, her voice tight. But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't mean to, but you did it anyway. Her words were like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. It wasn't about physical cheating, it was about the emotional distance. It was about me sharing things with someone else, connecting with someone else, while she had been sitting at home, trying to hold on to a marriage that I had let slip through my fingers without even realizing it. And then everything clicked. The sudden weirdness in her behavior, the late-night calls, the strange perfume. She hadn't been avoiding me because of a lover. She had been avoiding me because she knew. She had seen the way I was pulling away, the way I was starting to confide in someone else. She had been the one who'd noticed the cracks in our relationship long before I had. You're not the only one who's been lonely, she said softly, almost like a whisper. I've been here, day after day, trying to keep this together. But you've been drifting, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I started looking for signs. And then I found them. I swallowed hard, my throat thick with regret. This wasn't how I imagined things going. I had thought I was just dealing with a simple misunderstanding, a shift in our routine, a change I could fix. But the truth, the real truth, was much more complicated. It was about me losing sight of her, of us. I couldn't even look at her now. The guilt, the shame, it was overwhelming. I had been so caught up in my own life, in my own ambitions, that I hadn't seen the signs. I hadn't seen her, the person who had been standing beside me all along. But I knew one thing for sure. Everything was different now. I had to face it. There was no turning back. Emily, I started, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to apologize for what I had done, how to explain that I never meant to hurt her. The words felt empty, useless in the face of everything that had come to light. She shook her head gently. I don't need your apologies, not right now. I just need you to understand what's happening here. What we've been avoiding. I nodded slowly. Maybe that was the hardest part of all. Understanding. It was clear now. We weren't just dealing with infidelity. We were dealing with something deeper, something we had both ignored for far too long. A relationship, once strong, now hanging on by the thinnest thread. And if we were going to fix this, we had a long, difficult road ahead. But the first step, realizing where we both went wrong. The silence between us stretched, heavy and suffocating, as if the weight of all the words that hadn't been said had filled the room. I stood there, my hands trembling, as the truth continued to settle around us like a dark cloud. We had been the ones to tear each other apart. It wasn't some other person. It wasn't just the time or the distance. It was us. We had slowly unraveled ourselves without even realizing it, each of us hiding behind walls we'd built long ago. Emily stepped away from me, slowly, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She was trying to keep herself composed, but I could see the cracks. I could feel the tremors in her movements, in the way her jaw tightened as if fighting back tears. The woman I had once known, the woman who had always been so sure of herself, was now standing before me, fragile in a way I had never seen before. "Do you even want to fix this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. But the question struck me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't about forgiveness. Not yet. At least, it was about whether we were even willing to try. I opened my mouth, but the words seemed inadequate. How could I fix something that had been broken for so long? How could I repair the damage I had caused without even realizing I was doing it? Could I go back? Could we go back? I don't know. I admitted, my voice hoarse. But I'm willing to try. She nodded, her eyes locked onto mine, searching for something I wasn't sure I could give her. She took another step back, and I felt an unfamiliar chill wash over me. It was as though the last thread of connection between us had frayed, and the silence that followed felt like the end. "You're not the only one who's been lost, you know," she said quietly, her eyes not leaving mine. "I've been waiting for you to see me, for you to notice I was still here, trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. And I don't know if I can do this anymore." Her voice cracked at the end of her sentence, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It wasn't just regret. It was the realization that I had hurt her deeply, not just by neglecting her, but by failing her in the most fundamental way. I had stopped seeing her not just as my wife, but as herself, a person with dreams, with fears, with a life that didn't revolve around me. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but she raised a hand to stop me. "No," she said firmly, her eyes hardening, though the vulnerability still lingered beneath the surface. "It's too late for words." My heart sank as she walked towards the door. It wasn't the way I had imagined it. The dramatic confrontation, the tears, the yelling, the closure, but it felt like the most definitive moment of all. I had already lost her, not just emotionally, but in a way that could never be fixed by words alone. I followed her to the door, my breath shallow, my chest tight with the weight of everything unsaid. "You can't fix this," she repeated, her back to me, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Not like this. Not with promises. Not with apologies. You have to want to fix yourself first. You have to be honest with yourself." With me, I wanted to say I understood. I wanted to tell her I would change, that I would do whatever it took to win her back. But the truth was I wasn't sure if I could. I wasn't sure if the person I had become, this man who had been lost in his own ambitions, his own desires, was someone she could ever love again. For a long moment, I just stood there, helpless. The air felt thick and suffocating. And then, finally, she turned to face me one last time. "I loved you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I loved you with everything I had. But sometimes love isn't enough. And sometimes, when you hurt someone enough, they can't go back to who they were." They become something else. And that's who I am now. I'm not the woman who waited for you to notice me. I'm the woman who has finally seen what you've turned me into. Her eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was resignation. And in that moment, I knew that I had already lost her in a way that I couldn't get back. I can't do this anymore, Vibe, she said, her voice softening into something almost tender. I need to find myself again. And I can't do that if I'm still holding on to someone who's no longer there. The door clicked shut behind her, and I was left standing in the silence, the weight of her words pressing on my chest. My knees buckled, and I sank onto the couch, my hands gripping the edges of the seat, my head spinning. She was gone, not just physically, but in a way that went deeper than I could have ever imagined. She had slipped through my fingers slowly, over time, while I had been too blind, too self-absorbed to notice. And now, all I could do was stare at the empty space where she had once stood. I thought of all the things I should have said, the things I should have done, the signs I missed, the moments I could have changed. But it was too late for any of it. And in that moment, as I sat there, alone, I realized the true weight of what I had lost. It wasn't just a wife, a lover, a partner. It was a person who had trusted me, loved me, and believed in me. And I had let her down. The emptiness I felt now was the kind that comes from realizing you've done something so irrevocable, so painful, that there's no coming back from it. The woman I had once known was gone, and in her place, there was a stranger. A woman who had seen through the facade I'd built, who had seen the truth I had been hiding from myself. I sat there for what felt like hours, too numb to cry, too exhausted to move. I had no idea what came next, only that everything had changed, and I had no one